Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Rain fell gently on the cold ground of the Brooksville Cemetery, that quiet little Missouri village where every stone seemed laden with forgotten stories. It wasn't a violent rain, but a steady drizzle, fine and penetrating, the kind of rain that slowly seeps into clothes and bones, as if it wanted to mingle with the grief of the living. The air smelled of wet earth, moss, and dead leaves, that typical autumn mixture, so familiar and yet so strangely solemn today. The silence was thick, almost sacred. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. The muffled sound of boots on soft earth, the few suppressed sobs, the whisper of an umbrella buffeted by the wind, all contributed to the impression that the entire world had stopped to observe Thomas Mitchell's final journey. Caroline Mitchell, widowed for barely a week, stood there, straight despite the weight that bent her soul. At 58, she looked like a woman frozen in time. Her black coat, soaked to the shoulders, clung to her like a second skin. Her chestnut hair, pulled back in a neat bun, let a few wet strands escape and clung to her forehead. Her gaze remained fixed on the freshly dug grave of the man she had loved all her life. Thomas. Thomas, her husband, her pillar of strength, her confidant. 33 years together. A life woven slowly, patiently, like an old Midwestern quilt, a patchwork of laughter, disagreements, kept promises, silent sacrifices. He had never been an expansive man, he didn't offer flowers or deliver impassioned speeches, but he had always been there. Present. Reliable. Dignified. A history teacher with a calm voice, beloved by his students, respected by his colleagues, known for his passion for great stories and his mania for correcting mistakes in the local newspapers. His absence was already creating a void in Caroline whose depth she hadn't yet realized. She wanted to cry. To scream. To fall to her knees. But her tears had frozen somewhere between her throat and her stomach, as if blocked by disbelief. How could a heart that beat so strongly, such a constant presence, just fade away without leaving a trace of sound? Life now seemed unreal, as if she were an extra in a play she hadn't chosen. At his side, his son, Andrew, stood straight, stiff as a statue. At 33, he had inherited his father's calm, but without his gentleness. Ambition, the frenetic pace of life in Chicago, the years of competition and solitude in law firms had hardened him. His face betrayed no emotion. No tears, no trembling. Just that clenched jaw, that distant, almost icy gaze. Caroline glanced at him briefly out of the corner of her eye. She no longer truly recognized her son. This young man she had raised with tenderness and patience, this boy who spent hours building forts with his father in the garden, had become a polite, distant stranger. Since Thomas's death, Andrew had returned to stay at the family home for a few days. But their conversations were rare, superficial. Each of their discussions resembled an exercise in diplomacy, each word carefully weighed to avoid slip-ups. The pain had not brought them closer. On the contrary, it had exposed the long-standing cracks between them. And yet, there he was, by her side. Silent. Present. Like a shadow. And in that silence, there was something disturbing she couldn't name. The ceremony over, people began to leave, one after the other. A few timid handshakes, misty glances, awkward murmurs, "My condolences, he was a good man, if you need anything, don't hesitate." So many mechanical phrases, spoken more out of habit than genuine compassion. The kind of words that ring hollow when the soul is in ruins. Caroline didn't respond to any of these gestures. She stood frozen, arms crossed against herself, in front of the freshly closed grave. The dark, still loose earth gave her a sense of incompleteness. The coffin was no longer visible, and yet she couldn't tear her eyes away, as if she were still waiting for something to emerge, a voice, a breath, a miracle. But there was nothing. Just the wind. She didn't even notice that the people had moved away. Only Andrew's straight, motionless figure still stood a few steps away from her, his hands in the pockets of his long black coat. It was he who broke the silence. "Mom, come on. It's time to go home." His voice was neither soft nor harsh. Just matter of fact, like a line of dialogue in a well-oiled script. Caroline slowly turned her head toward him, as if waking from a dream. She nodded wordlessly. Her legs, numb from cold and grief, struggled to carry her. She walked slowly toward the black rental car her son had rented when he arrived from Chicago. The journey passed in a strange, heavy, almost unreal silence. The windshield wipers came and went at regular intervals, scraping the wet windshield with a dull noise that seemed to punctuate the emptiness of their thoughts. Each beat sounded like a comma in an overlong sentence. The landscape slowly passed by behind the fogged windows, the worn wooden fences, the old, crumbling barns, the trees already bare from autumn. Everything seemed blurred, as if seen through a layer of sadness. Caroline kept her eyes fixed on the window, but her mind wandered. She remembered the times Thomas had driven her home after dinner, a school party, a simple walk. He always had one hand on the steering wheel, the other gently resting on her thigh. They hadn't always needed to speak to understand each other. The silence with him was tender. The one that reigned now in this car seemed icy. And then she noticed something was wrong. This wasn't the right path. "You're not turning toward Brooksville," she said finally, her voice low, a little worried. Andrew remained focused on the road, his face impassive. "Non." He had just turned off the main road onto a winding side road lined with dense trees. It was the old country road, the one you avoided in winter because of the ice, the one that led to the woods. A road Caroline was vaguely familiar with, but hadn't taken in years. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, finally asking a question, as if waking from a long sleep. Andrew took a slow breath. He seemed to be weighing his words. "You'll see." His vague, almost evasive answer made Caroline's chest tighten. She finally turned her eyes to him. He wasn't looking at her. He seemed absorbed in something else. Something invisible. Caroline's heart began to beat faster. There was something strangely calculated about the silence, as if this road, this detour, were not an accident, but a choice. A plan. An intention. She tightened her scarf around her neck and clasped her hands in her lap. The trees were passing by, more and more numerous, darker, taller. The asphalt seemed to thin out. And as they drove further down this forgotten road, Caroline felt they were leaving much more behind than just a cemetery. After about 30 minutes of silent driving, as daylight began to fade behind the hills, Andrew pulled over abruptly to the shoulder of a narrow road lined with dense pine trees and wild brush. The crunch of gravel under the tires was the only sound that broke the silence. He turned off the engine without a word. Caroline, surprised by the sudden stop, raised her head and looked around. There was nothing in sight. No houses. No streetlights. Just the winding road, the darkening gray sky, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Andrew stood still for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His face was tense, hard, almost frozen. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then he turned his head towards her and declared, in a calm but firm voice. "Mom, this is where you get off." Caroline blinked, as if she'd misheard. Her heart skipped a beat. "What? What are you saying?" She stared at him, her brow furrowed, her breath coming out short. It took a few seconds for the reality of his words to break through the fog in her mind. A lonely road, a sudden stop, and that sentence, heavy with innuendo. Andrew finally looked at her. Really? And what she saw in his eyes struck her more than the words themselves. It wasn't anger. It was something else. A profound fatigue. A weariness. And perhaps, deep down, a form of long-accumulated frustration. "You have to start your life over, Mom," he said in a lower, almost resigned tone. "Dad's gone. And you can't keep living in that house full of memories. It's not a grave. It's not where you're going to heal. You can't just stay locked up, going around in circles, waiting for time to erase everything. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Her throat tightened. A mixture of pain, incomprehension, and humiliation rose within her like a black wave. So you want me to come down here? Alone? In the middle of the woods? His voice trembled. She wanted to believe he was joking, testing her reactions. But nothing in his expression betrayed any playfulness. He remained frozen, straight, impassive. There's a house at the end of the road, he said, pointing to a barely visible path through the trees. A mile from here. I rented it for you. An old, renovated cabin. It's got enough to live on for a few weeks. Wood, food, something to write with, read with, think with. You need silence. Isolation. You'll see, it'll do you good. She stared at him with wide eyes. It wasn't just the brutality of the gesture that shocked her, but the idea that her own son saw her as a burden to be repositioned. Like a piece moved on a chessboard because it was cluttering the center. Couldn't you have asked me? Told me about it beforehand? Offered me a choice? Andrew sighed, looked away. I knew you would have said no. You would have found 1,000 reasons to stay frozen. So I did what I had to do. He got out without waiting for her answer, walked around the car, and opened the trunk. Caroline, as if frozen, watched him pull out his suitcases. 2 large black suitcases that she'd barely had time to fill before the funeral. He set them down on the side of the road without another word. As if he were dropping off a load. The wind had picked up. It slapped the trees and whipped her coat. Caroline slowly descended. Her legs were shaking, not just from the cold. She set foot on the damp ground and felt the clay sink beneath her shoes. She looked up at him, hoping for a final word, a gesture of tenderness, a look of encouragement. But Andrew was already back in the car. He drove off without saying goodbye. And most importantly, without looking back. Caroline stood alone on the side of that forgotten road, her suitcases at her feet, her heart ripped. The sound of the engine gradually faded away, disappearing into the wind. And in that total silence, in the middle of nowhere, she understood that something had just broken. But she still didn't know if it was her heart, or her fear. The forest path was narrow, barely visible, overgrown with dead leaves and low branches. Caroline moved slowly, dragging her suitcases behind her, fighting against fatigue, cold, and still searing humiliation. The wind had died down, but the trees, tall and silent, seemed to be watching her solitary walk. She walked for nearly a mile, her heavy, hesitant footsteps echoing in the silence. Then, finally, around the bend of a thicket, she saw a dark wooden building nestled in a small clearing. Isolated. Modest. Surrounded by an old garden overgrown with moss and ivy. The small house at the end of the lane was simple, almost rustic. It was an old chalet, its wooden shutters creaking in the wind. A covered porch surrounded the facade, with 2 faded wicker chairs perched on either side of the front door. The lock creaked as she opened it, and a cold, slightly dusty air welcomed her inside. The floor creaked beneath his feet. Everything in the main room seemed like something out of another era, an old farmhouse table scratched by the years, a black wood stove with cast-iron legs, an armchair warped by use. The bed, simple and narrow, was covered with a plaid blanket in shades of red and gray. The smell of raw wood and the past permeated every corner. But it was the library that caught his eye. Against the back wall, a massive bookshelf filled with time-worn books. Classic American novels, poetry collections, old newspapers, and even a leather-bound notebook in which someone, perhaps the previous owner, had scribbled thoughts, recipes, memories. On the table, a sheet of paper folded in 2. She recognized it immediately. Andrew's writing. You'll find what you need here. Take your time. You'll see that you're stronger than you think. Andrew. She stood for a long time, rereading these few lines, unable to decide whether they soothed her or hurt her more. She placed the note on the table, then sat down in the armchair and remained there, without moving, 4 hours. The first few days were terribly difficult. The silence in the house wasn't the silence of peace. It was an oppressive emptiness, a silence that screamed in her ears like an absence one couldn't ignore. Every creak of the wood, every breath of wind against the windows reminded her that she was alone. Truly alone. Loneliness was a relentless companion. The night seemed endless. Lying in this bed too big for her alone, Caroline stared at the ceiling, listening to the beating of her own heart, the tears streaming silently down her temples. She spoke to Thomas, in a low voice, as she had always done when he read in the living room. But there was no longer any response. Just the echo of her own voice in the void. She opened the old boxes of letters she had brought with her. Reread every word, every promise. She revisited their past, photo after photo, remembering the happy days, the picnics by the lake, the simple but sincere birthdays, the evenings together with a crackling old record. She also remembered the arguments, the tense silences, the compromises. Their life hadn't been perfect, but it had been real. And yet, slowly, something changed. A week later, one foggy morning, Caroline woke up feeling different. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but an absence of heaviness. A first, lighter breath. She sat down at the old wooden table, steaming coffee in her hands, and opened a notebook she'd found at the bottom of a drawer. At first, she jotted down a few thoughts, scattered words, snatches of sentences, confused feelings. Then, like a dam breaking, everything began to flow out, memories, images, inner dialogues. Her hand could no longer keep up with the flow. She wrote every day. Sometimes for hours, until the fire in the stove crackled again, until the light faded. She wrote as one bleeds, without filter, without artifice. She recounted her youth, her first steps in life, her forgotten dreams. She spoke of Thomas, of course, but also of herself, of the woman she had been before becoming a wife, before becoming a mother. A curious woman, passionate about reading, fascinated by human psychology, eager for chosen solitude. The days took on a new rhythm. She rose earlier and earlier, driven by a new energy. She walked every morning in the woods, breathing deeply, listening to the songs of chickadees and blue jays. She learned to recognize animal tracks on the damp earth, to watch the clouds for rain, to marvel at the simple ballet of falling leaves. She started cooking again, improvising dishes with little but a lot of love. She ate alone, yes, but with gratitude. Meals became rituals. She turned the music back on, sometimes jazz, sometimes classical, and sometimes even danced, alone in the kitchen, barefoot on the old parquet floor. She no longer looked at the time. Or at notifications. The outside world had faded, replaced by an inner space that was coming back to life. She rediscovered the pleasure of reading for hours without interruption, of taking notes, of rereading the same passage simply because it resonated. A month later, as snow began to dust the trees in the clearing, Caroline finished her manuscript. The notebook was filled to the last page, covered in fine, dense handwriting. The story was titled, What the Silence Told Me, an intimate, raw, and moving text. A journey into grief, but also into the light that can sometimes filter through. She typed it out on an old cell phone Andrew had left her. And, not really believing it, she sent it to a publishing house in Chicago. She chose the house almost at random, guided by a tenuous intuition. Then she almost forgot she'd done it. 2 weeks later, the phone rang in the cabin. Caroline jumped, the old receiver had barely rung since she arrived. She picked it up, her hand trembling. Ms. Mitchell? This is Sarah Langdon, editorial director at Halstead Books. I read your manuscript. Anne. I wanted to tell you that I cried. Not once, but 3 times. What you wrote is incredibly truthful. We'd like to publish it. As soon as possible. Caroline remained silent for a few seconds. She began to cry softly, but this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude. Of having been heard. Read. Touched. A few weeks later, as winter was in full swing, Andrew returned. He hadn't warned anyone. He'd just come to see, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of concern, what had become of his mother after leaving her there, alone. He parked his car in the same spot. He took the path he didn't know well. When he arrived at the cabin, he saw her through the window. She was sitting in the armchair, reading, a blanket on her knees, an unknown cat purring against her. It had probably invited itself in, like serenity. He stood outside for a long moment, frozen, looking at this woman, whom he hardly recognized anymore. She seemed straighter, calmer, but above all, more present. His mother was no longer the broken shadow he had left. She was there. Whole. Caroline finally looked up and saw him through the window. She stood up quietly, opened the door, and looked at him without saying anything. He approached slowly. His bright eyes betrayed an emotion he could no longer contain. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally said hoarsely. "I wanted to help you, but I did it wrong." She looked at him for a long time. Then opened her arms. He threw himself into it like a child. She hugged him tightly, like someone you thought you'd lost forever. And in that finally peaceful silence, she understood that they were both those who needed solitude to heal. Two who had found each other again, in absence, in pain, and in rebuilding. 3 years later, Caroline Mitchell had become much more than a renowned author. Sun premiere roman, Get Down Here, published in a small, almost confidential print run, had met with an unexpected response. Word of mouth had done its work. Readers, and readers, had recognized themselves in its words, loss, silence, mourning, but also this slow, intimate, discreet resurrection. It was not a story of miracles, nor of spectacular revenge, but a human story. Raw. True. Powerful. The book was quickly reissued, translated, and awarded prizes. Caroline, who had avoided the spotlight her entire life, suddenly found herself invited onto television shows, to universities, and to literary circles. Everywhere, people wanted to hear this woman who had transformed abandonment into rebirth, pain into words. But she remained true to herself. She chose to continue living in the small cabin, which had become her refuge, her anchor. She rejected the luxurious apartments in New York, the glossy TV sets, the overly formatted contracts. She preferred her wood-burning stove, the blank pages, the sunrises through the pines. She transformed part of the house, once a dusty attic, into a writing studio. A modest but warm place, where she sometimes welcomed other women. Widows, survivors of violence, lost mothers, forgotten wives. Women who, like her, had been pushed to come down here, and who no longer knew where to go back up. She offered them neither solutions nor miracles. But she offered them a place. Silence. Hot tea. An ear. A sentence. A notebook. Among these women, some wrote. Others cried. Still others gardened. But all, in their own way, were starting something. And that was enough. The media began to talk about The House in the Woods, an unworldly place in the heart of Missouri where rebirth became possible. Caroline, for her part, wasn't seeking fame or recognition. She was writing a second book. And a third. Essays. Open letters. Journals. She spoke of solitude, the beauty of silence, the need to listen to one's pain in order to better transform it. She received hundreds of letters from readers. Some from faraway lands. Others signed by trembling hands, by broken hearts. She replied often. Sometimes at length. Sometimes with just a single sentence. But every time she signed a copy of Get Down Here, she wrote the same dedication, without exception. This is where you get off. But this isn't the end. This is the beginning. Caroline knew these words weren't just a sentence. They were a key. A passage. A thread stretched between chaos and light. And in that cabin, where she had been left like a forgotten suitcase, she had ended up building a house. A home. a sanctuary. Not despite the pain, but with her.